Fans. Not today, because Tennessee killed them. I like that. I don't care about OSU. I care about Tennessee. My two teams won yesterday, so I'm a happy guy. All right, there we go. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20. That's where we're picking up this morning. We're basically looking at the life of Solomon, even though we're starting to get an introduction to James. We will get to James, believe it or not, but when we get all the prerequisites down, I believe going through James is so much easier. So we're talking right now about King Solomon and Solomon's house and kingdom in chapter 4. We're looking at the wisdom that God had given him to run and rule his nation and what it looked like. Many times, and we're going to spend some time with a lot of issues because I think wisdom is a really large subject in the Bible. I don't know if you realize that, but the greatest example, I believe, is Solomon, because not only is Solomon discussing it with God that he needed wisdom to run and rule this nation, this wonderful nation that God had decided that he was the one of the sons of David to assume the Davidic role and be king over Israel, and that was passed to him, and he knows that God made him king. And that was a good step to wisdom. And we'll see how he rules and reigns, but it doesn't mean he had overall wisdom in all spheres of life. And we will see that as we go through these 11 chapters, how Solomon also wrote the Proverbs, which is a book of wisdom that he was trying to give to his son and to us. And I believe a lot of Solomon's wisdom for life came from David. And we'll see some of those things as we traverse through 1 Kings chapter 1 through 11. We're in chapter 4. We've already looked at some of the ideas of wisdom that Solomon exuded by how he made a judgment with the two harlots over the child, and how now he picked his cabinets, his governors, and so on and so forth. And again, I want to remind you, these guys were not only really up for the job that they were given, they were also willing to fight for the nation and protect the nation. However, in Solomon's rule and reign, God blessed his rule and reign, and for 40 years Solomon had rest and they had safety, and we'll see some of the things that Solomon establishes so they will have peace and safety. And not only will we see that, we'll spend a big majority of the time in those chapters where Solomon builds a temple for God. And so, although many of you may feel it's an insignificant thing, that was a significant part of Israel's history. So I was sitting in my office the other day, and I'm studying stuff on Solomon. I'm going, my mind's a little scrambled. I'm getting old, so there's issues trying to meld the jello. But I find it fascinating that God has set us up that we're doing on Sunday morning James, but we're looking at Solomon and his wisdom. And on Wednesday night, we're studying the importance of Israel, and there's going to be times both those collide. Both those come together. And we'll see that as we do this, so I'm not going to say, hey, this will fit perfectly into this on Wednesday night. But prayerfully, you'll see how the importance of Israel is magnified through Solomon's rule and reign and what he does to establish it. But the most important thing is he built his temple called Solomon's Temple, and we'll go through all that at that time as we traverse through this. So that's where we're going. We're going to finish prayerfully chapter 4 this morning. We're going to get into chapter 5 through 9 later, and then we're going to see the end of Solomon's life. But all of these, except Solomon's personal life, does not exude the prayer that was answered. In other words, we're going to see in our lives, we have wisdom that's given to us by God to know how to lead a wise life. We don't need a specific extra help. Solomon needed specific extra help to lead his life because he was king over the nation of Israel. Wouldn't you love to have a wise president, a godly man or woman? I don't want to be negative on that, but don't expect that. Don't go in with the expectations that we have this in our nation. We want to get close. We want to make sure that they exude biblical principles as best they can. But I think on both sides, well, one side really, never mind. But one side is close. There's some close ideals there. But nobody's going to be King Solomon. Nobody's going to be King David. And nobody at all is going to be King Jesus. And when King Jesus comes, he'll rule fairly. He will rule with a rod of iron. Peace will be established for 1,000 years until Satan's released. And That's not our subject for this morning. It's kind of interesting. So we're going to pick up in verse 20 this morning. We're going to look at Solomon's house and kingdom. House and kingdom. Again, he's going to deal with executing and dealing with certain things within his household. So just for estimate's sakes, the Bible doesn't perfectly say this, but Solomon had in his employment within his house between 2,000 and 2,300 people to run and execute his house and the nation's government. These are the people in this umbrella that we're going to look at the end of 1 Kings chapter 4. It's a fascinating thing, but something most of you don't know, and I sure don't know, and I don't know where I would find these numbers. How much does it cost to run the government? And what? Probably too much, somebody should have said. And we don't have, I remember the great words of Davy Crockett when he was in Congress. He says, we are stewards of the people's money and we should use it wisely. And I've kind of used that in my life and here at the church. We're using other people's money. We should use it wisely. But when we look at what Solomon spent, you'll say, oh my goodness, so how much did it really cost him to run the government? You know, how many figures are we talking about? And understand that day and age, it was different how to accrue stuff to now. And we're going to do a lot of numbers that have to do with today, but it was a lot. It was a lot. Verse 20 says this, and this is where we're going to start. Verse 20 says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. So this verse is fascinating to start off our subject this morning because we could see very much Israel had grown like God had promised to be as numerous as the sands of the seashore. Now, if you don't know what that means, don't try and count it. It just means it was a massive amount of people. You couldn't even count them. Okay, it's an idiom for saying countless. I've been on the beach and I don't even think I could count a jar full of sand. Okay, you ever done those? How many jelly beans are in a jar? And you go, well, I can get within 10 maybe or something. But this is sand at seashore, and it's just an idiom for Israel had grown. They were massive. They covered a lot of area, and one man couldn't significantly do that job of caring and judging for everybody and keeping the peace and well, along with that, though, when it says they were eating, drinking, and rejoicing, it wasn't a party time. In other words, everybody was doing normal life and were peaceful. There wasn't any problems. We had just come out of David's rule and reign for 40 years, and David's rule and reign was one of war. And we'll talk about that briefly this morning. But they had come out of a lot of bloody conflicts. And anybody that knows when you're in a nation that's constantly under war, it's very hard to live life. You don't know if you're next. And that's pretty much what we have in the Middle East, especially in Israel. They're target. Everybody's running around with targets on their back, and their nation's trying to protect them their best they can from terrorists around them. And when we see this, Israel had been cleansed and kept safe because of what David did. And David could not build the temple because he was a man of blood. And when we talk about the land they acquired, it says, verse 21, now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river, that is from the river Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines, which is pretty much the Gaza Strip today, that area, and to the border of Egypt. And they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So again, although we talk about this land, and it's important for us to see, they hadn't accrued all the land God had promised them. Under Solomon's rule, they got as close as they could to fulfilling what we call the land covenant part of the Abrahamic covenant. They didn't get it all, but they were really close. And I think last week, I'm sure if I went back a few slides, I could show you it. But last week we talked about how much land they did acquire. And it was a lot of land. And again, a lot of people confined in that land. And that's important for us to see. And again, when we talk about this, this is today. Let's talk about today's Israel. They're half of what they were under the time of Solomon in land. And through the wars of my lifetime, they've given back some of that land. So they keep getting smaller instead of larger, even though they win wars, which is kind of scratch their head with that one. But that's what Israel's trying to do to basically keep peace so their enemies won't bother them. And that has not done anything. I would say just take land and never mind. You can do that. But anyway, this part of Israel that now is under Solomon's rule was fully inhabited. And there's a lot of people within that habitation. And Solomon has been given by God the wisdom to rule this nation. And the results is Solomon's judgment, not only with the two harlots that drew national attention, because we saw at the end of that, the whole nation had heard what Solomon had done. Because Israel heard the judgment, they feared and awed the reverence of the king. So Solomon was well respected by the people. And Israel saw the wisdom of God in action. They saw that Solomon was a great administrator of a nation that would have justice that would be carried out. And Solomon then, throughout his administration, he chose wise men to help rule with him wisely, who loved Israel, who would want to protect Israel, who honored him as king and were loyal to him. This also was while a consistent display of wisdom was constantly going on under Solomon's rule. And we're seeing some of that. That's where we're probably much exploring what's going on here. God had promised to Solomon, after he had given him what he asked for, he said, I'm also going to give you riches and honor. Why would you say, okay, God blessed him to be a rich man? Well, let me explain to you. To run a government like Solomon had, he needed money. He needed the ability to delineate the funds and to get them out there. And he absolutely needed honor so that there would not be... here's an interesting part of this verse that we looked at before. But that Solomon's wisdom and his honor and his riches, there was no king anywhere around him that was his equal. And that makes it really good to establish relationships with other people when you're number one. And that means you have the rule and the right to oversee that and set the standards. And we'll see in a couple of weeks, as he's building the temple, he's kind of making a contract, a really good business contract with Hiram, the king of Tyre. And you got to think the whole time, Solomon is so much better than him, but the contract is so fair. Which is kind of interesting because Tyre is still considered part of the Canaanites. And you say, why is God allowing that? Because God has his king ruling. And when you know the king that God has selected to rule over that nation, all the other nations are subordinate to him. When Jesus rules, is every nation going to be perfectly godly? No. But he will rule. And why does he have to rule with a rod of iron if every nation's submissive and doing exactly and peaceful? Because why? Because they're not godly nations. And that always fascinates me, too, to know that. So when we talk about Solomon's kingdom somewhat, we have to understand that when the Messiah comes back and rules and reigns, there's significant common ground that they will have. So Solomon would be blessed with wealth, and we know, in fact, he was. He was not only blessed in what he did, he was also blessed in who he was and how he was honored. God had given to Solomon all that he had, and as part of Israel as a nation, they enjoyed a time of peace. When they said shalom, they meant it. Prosperity and blessings from God that they saw in their lives as they would live life because their king, listen, because their king had a godly life. Isn't that kind of cool? Israel was a nation that was separated out from amongst all the nations so that they would set the standard and be a light shining into the darkness of the world. And they hadn't done it. And under Solomon was a light that shone to that nation so the nation could shine to the world. And we see that this blessing aided and added to the growth of Israel as a nation in population and in expansion of land. Now just think about it. When you're bigger, when you're better, when you're more well-equipped and you're run by godly men, who's your enemies? And would you worry that much about your enemies? But not at this time. And remember what David said in his administration, the battle is the Lord's, and David did what? He fought the battles. The battles were the Lord, and now this nation under Solomon is the Lord's. And this is as close as they're going to get to that godly nation God wanted when he called them out of Egypt. Verse 22 says this. It says, and Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. I don't know about you, that sounds like a lot of food. I like to watch cooking shows. I don't know if any of you like to watch that. And when they have a big business and they're going in there to make the day's vat of food and they're stirring it with a boat oar, I'm thinking, I don't know how to make that recipe fit for my house. You know, what are you putting in here? 8 pounds of lard, 6 pounds of tomatoes. You know, I'm going, wait a second. This is like cooking for a fleet. You know, I'm cooking for 2. So you got to kind of say that doesn't always work. So when we're looking at Solomon's and his riches, let me kind of do the math for you. Let me kind of do the math. In First Chronicles, let's just go there. Go to 1 Chronicles 1. These are similar verses, parallel passage. 1 Chronicles chapter 1, 14 through 17. That's not it. 2 Chronicles. It's always a typo with this guy. I don't get it. It's 2 Chronicles. It's 2 Chronicles. I even have 2 Chronicles. Look, you want to see this? I have it in my notes. 2 Chronicles, where was I? Chapter 1, verse 14, it says, Solomon amassed chariots and horsemen. He had 14,000 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. And the king made silver and gold as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones. How many of you have a rock garden? Can you imagine that all being gold and silver? My football practice was on a rock field when I was a kid. And you sort of like said, I'm going to get tackled right here, and I'm going to die, so let me move a few. If it's gold, okay, we're good. Put it in my pockets. No. But it's saying it's so common as a rock. And the king made silver and gold as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars as plentiful as sycamores in the lowland. And Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Crew, and the king's traders procured them from Cuba for a price, and they imported chariots from Egypt. The best place to get chariots was Egypt, and 600 shekels of silver apiece, and horses of 150 shekels apiece. And by the same means, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. Now, it's interesting. The reason I'm saying this is because this is a lot of stuff Solomon has. And he's dealing with all these things. So let's talk about this. First of all, back in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 23, when he's talking about, and 22, when he's talking about a core, I don't know if any of you have ever received a core of anything, so it's not a common term. A core is equal to 10 bushels. A core is equal to 10 bushels. We can know that because we've heard different terms in economy talking about a bushel of corn is this much and so on and so forth. A bushel equals 4. I didn't write it all up here because sometimes you get bogged down into math and you go, what? But I want to show you how much of that is equal to 10 bushels. A bushel is 42 pounds. 42 pounds. 1 bushel equals 42 loaves of bread at a pound apiece, or more, depends on how you make it. A loaf of bread today is $4. You all staying up with me? Unless you go to the yard sale I went to, that loaf of bread was $8. The lady was making some sourdough Christian cinnamon bread. There we go. And it was $8. No, it was $8. And the loaf had shrunk from anyway, bread loaves have shrunk anyway. To cost today for 30 cores of fine flour would be by 10 bushels. Oh, I do have part of this up here. So basically, the 10 bushels would be 300 cores. 300 cores at 90 cores, 2,700 loaves. Bread. Basically, bread came out to $108,000 worth of bread. Just bread for one day. I don't know about you. If I put that in my basket, how many baskets of bread would you bring out? Just kind of think of that. So I put next to that, yikes, because I get excited when it's $4. I go, what? It's bread. The protein supplement, which is probably what this is used for in the 60 cores of meal. 60 cores of meal is 60 bushels. Again, this is a little bit heavier. It's 48 pounds a bushel. At $58 a bushel, it's $1.5 million today. $1.5 million. This is for 1 day feeding. Then oxen, fattened oxen, probably about 10,000. Pasture-fed oxen are a little bit more expensive, about $40,000 worth. Deer, gazelles, roebucks. I don't know how to put that down on paper. I don't know if somebody was out there. What's your job? I'm hunting the daily food. But I've seen these in zoos, so I know they're real things. Fattened fowl, I would say turkey and pheasant under glass. Okay? So they were eating really well. That was the daily need. Daily need. And God, through Solomon, met their daily need. I don't know about you, just supplying for the house, not the government, not the people. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. So you say at least $2 million a day. And most of you say, well, we can afford that for what? I'll do breakfast. You know? And then I'm busted. But think about daily needs met. In Philippians 4:19, it says, God is going to richly meet your needs. He'll supply your needs. Not your wants. I always find that fascinating. But your needs. And in Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says a similar thing, but it's seeking first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. Now, is that for today application? Well, I just look at it like this. God knows what we need, and he takes care of you. And most of us in America probably live with a lot of ingratitude. I worked in the food industry only for 3 years as a kid, and I seen so much food thrown away, you have no idea. And that was when I was a kid. And most of you can go through a restaurant and see food that people, why'd you order out of that food? I like a seafood restaurant in town, and I love how people, they don't realize the portions are pretty good. And they walk away from the table leaving most of the stuff. Why'd you order that? Take it home. You can't eat it another day. And I'm sitting there saying to myself, I haven't had an onion ring in a while, and I want to. And my wife will always say, stop that. If you weren't here, I would. But think about this. This is Solomon's expense account. And the Bible's very honest with us to show how much it took to run a household. Now, most of you would just die if this was your household expense account, right? People would be fired, you know? But most of you just get excited. My kids are growing. You should see my food bill. Solomon's food bill versus yours kind of thing. But remember what's happening too in verse 24 of 1 Kings chapter 4. We're back in 1 Kings chapter 4. Verse 24 says, for he had dominion over everything west of the river from Tifsah even to Gaza, over all the kings of the west of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. So first of all, they gave the expense account. And now they're saying, look how his honor account's going. Look at Solomon's honor. He's basically has peace on all sides. Oh, my prayers today for the peace of Jerusalem, the peace in Israel. But they're not going to have it until Christ comes again. That's sad, but that's biblical. And you look around in Solomon's time, they had it. They had the peace on all sides. And not only that, don't miss this in this verse, he had dominion over other kings. His leadership, his authority from God spread to other nations. That means he could tell other nations what they were doing was not going to work out. He can stop them. He can make, and we'll see again in the following chapters how he makes an agreement, well, especially chapter 5 when it starts, he makes an agreement with King Hiram of Tyre, and you would think, well, Hiram would say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with you guys. We don't like you. And he has no choice because the dominion, he has to submit to it, but the paradigm of the contract was absolutely fair. And again, we'll see the food Solomon supplies for the workers for at least 7 to 9 years, because that's how long it took to build the temple. Depends on how you want to look at how that worked out. Verse 25 says, so Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon, Dan to Beersheba. It basically means north to south. North to south. They flourished. There's a president once said, I'm going to make sure every American has a chicken in every pot. Right? Everybody remember that? Who lived in that during that time? No, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. But think about this. Every man, it says, and it says it very eloquently, and I like how it's phrased, every man sat under his vine and his fig tree. In other words, he had his own fruit garden. And he was prosperous in his fruit garden, but that was his. He's had ownership of it. He could take care of his own family, feed his own family. So there was flourishing in the nation. I never did this, but it's kind of interesting. I believe during Solomon's time, nobody was in the class we would call poor. If they were, you'll see what Solomon does to make sure they're not poor. Oh, for such a government. In verse 26, it says, and Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses and his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. Now, I'm going to say this. There is a discrepancy. I'm going to take 2 seconds with this. In 2 Chronicles 9:25, it doesn't say 40,000 stalls for horses. It says 4,000. And we've already talked about this in the first class about bibliology. And I believe a typo might have been made in this verse here, because when you look at parallel, 40,000 stalls of horses is a lot. 4,000 is a lot. 2 is too many. That's it. It just depends on how you look at it. I'm not a horse guy, but I'm just thinking 4,000. So if you have the side column, it says one manuscript reads 4,000. I always said this: numbers are not going to matter to me. Solomon had a lot of horses. And one of the things you will see, and this is important for us to know, there's a warning. Well, let's just do it this way before I get to Deuteronomy. With all these guys, they had a standing army. They didn't need it. In Solomon's time, there's peace. So what would you think? Well, Solomon was wise. Let's disband the army and let's let them go be, farmers. Go farm. And that would be a really stupid move. Because the best display of strength is to have a strong standing army. So he buys the best made equipment. Today, America sells a lot of military equipment outside of America because we make good stuff. I'm going to tell you that now. I don't know why America doesn't make great cars. Maybe that's an argument for another time. But we can make tanks, we can make planes, we can make ships, and we sell them. Okay? Solomon's time, they were a standing army, a fighting machine that bought their Egyptian chariots. And Egypt was a solid standing army. They know how to make things to last. But there is a warning that's given to us in Deuteronomy 17. Now, I'm of a different cat than some people. They say Solomon was wrong here to accrue horses, because the warning in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy is what kings shouldn't accrue. Solomon didn't do this. God did this for Solomon. Do you understand the difference? Solomon was saying, I will be submissive to you as king, as my Lord. And God said, I will add riches and honor to you. So God supplied these things for him. So I look at this problem of Solomon in this minute. Now, what will happen is when Solomon breaks the other rule of the Deuteronomy 17, where he adds wives and things like that, that's Solomon pays for that problem. Kind of thing. But I don't put this on him that he accrued horses, as that warning said. God had said, I'm going to supply these things for you. So God supplies these things. And I think that's important as we look at what Solomon has as super important as far as a standing military. You have to have a standing military. Any president or any leader of this nation ever says, well, we really need to cut our forces in half, should be fired that moment he opens his mouth, or she opens her mouth. I just find that reproachable. Why would you lessen the strength of one of the greatest standing armies ever in human history as America? I like American strength. I like the sound of a Huey helicopter passing over my house. And when I lived in Homestead, I loved the jets flying low. I just knew that was cool. And when I got to Israel, guess what I heard flying low constantly? Jets. All over the place. And I knew they were in charge. An eye in the sky like that, they're in charge. And precision bombing that they do, that's all a different thing. Don't get me sidetracked. I'll do it myself. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 27. We look at Solomon's daily supply. And those deputies provided for King Solomon on all who came to King Solomon's table. Each in his month, they left nothing lacking. So I find it interesting. Solomon worked up a calendar that he knew was this guy's turn for this month. This month is Kislev or whatever. You're in charge of supplying for the house this extraordinary amount of food. And you bring it in for that month. And somebody else has that month. And somebody else has. So it was constantly a rotation. Could you imagine one person in charge of all that? Where do I resign? That's a lot of work. But he said, okay, this is your month. You know what's coming up. Be prepared. And as Joseph would do, you'd set aside stuff to, again, supply the palace with things to keep them duly supplied and duly fed. Verse 28 said they also brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds to place where it should be according to his charge. So they also fed the animals. And I'm thinking somebody was in charge of bringing in the oxen and the sheep, whatever they were eating. And you know what's still going on? Don't miss this. Sacrifices are still happening. And I think how many animals needed to be provided? And we're going to see in chapter 9, or is it 8? 8 or 9. When we get there, when the temple is brought up and it's already ready to be used, and they're dedicating the temple to God, and there's sacrifices. Oh my goodness, so many sacrifices. And I'm going to talk to you about how much, again, money and weight and just, it's a lot. And all this had to be organized. They didn't have a Reesers. And I don't know how you go to Reeser. What do you need? I need 300 bushels of wheat. I don't think they're going to supply that. The guy would look at you, just do it. On Monday, go to Reesers. Go to the service desk and say, by the way, next week we need 300 bushels of, I guarantee the guy's going to look at you like you need a jacket that ties behind you. Okay? That's just a crazy order. But it's fascinating that they took care of the house in different, what we call different divisions. And it's interesting. Who invented, just me talking, who invented the week? Say God. It works well. The next two questions I ask, answer God. Who invented the day, the 24-hour day? God. Who invented the year of 12 months? God. Now, I know some of you say, well, it's 13 months. And that. No, you know what I'm talking about. God did all this. Didn't say, oh, it evolved. How would that work? You know, some of the goofy things people say, I want to say, does it fit in all the boxes? See, God fits and checks every box. He made this. So if you say, boy, I'm tired, I wish days were shorter. It may happen soon, but that's going to be under God's judgment. Right? A whole different story. Okay, so let's get some facts on Solomon's blessings from God. And this is how this chapter closes out. Fascinating walk through this. So we look at verse 29. Verse 29 says, now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that is on the seashore. So first of all, this is a fact. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind. So you know something about how Hebrew writes, it's really saying the same thing 3 times. And when you say the 3 times something repetitively differently, you're emphasizing the fact that God gave Solomon wisdom. How would you say it? God gave Solomon very great discernment. That's insight to things. God gave Solomon breadth of mind. He had the thinking capacity Now, I once was told that we use a very small part of our brain, and I'm thinking as I get older, I'm using less of it. I'm using more paper than I am my mind because I got to remember certain things, so I write them down. If you don't believe me, I got paper in my pocket already for this week. I've written things down, and my problem is remembering where I put it. But I believe Solomon used the greater capacity of his brain that God had given him, and that was the ability to take God's word and apply it to the framework of life every day. And the span of who he was king. King over all the nation of Israel, and really he had some authority over other nations. He had a large authority span, and all that became because what God, don't miss the first word, gave Solomon. God gave it to him. He didn't earn it. He didn't spend time just accruing it from a book. God gave it to him because who Solomon was. And how does that work out? Because verse 30 says this is fact number 2. Verse 30 says, and Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. Now, Egypt was known for its wisdom. We know that if we go all the way back to Exodus. And the wise men of Egypt came in and helped do discussion, keeping Israel there with Moses and Aaron. And there was wise men there. We see from Daniel chapter 1 and 2, what we would call the east had wonderful wisdom. They had wise men. We see from Matthew chapter 2, wise men came from that area where Daniel probably was, came from the east, and we call them magi. And that's why we have these verses up here. He was wiser than all of those. Now, here's the interesting factor. When we go to Egypt, we'll go, I don't know why I didn't put that in order. We go to Egypt, Moses and Aaron had more wisdom because it was from God to deal with that situation. Now we're looking at one that had greater wisdom. Daniel exudes much wisdom, more than those around him in Babylon. We know that because the Babylonians King Nebuchadnezzar was about to kill all the wise men because they couldn't, interpret his dream. And Daniel says, piece of cake, I have a God that knows everything. And he interpreted the dream, so Daniel's wisdom was greater than Babylonians' wisdom, and Solomon's wisdom is greater than that. And then, of course, we have the Magi for coming from the east. I don't know how much wisdom they had, but they were wise enough to end up at the right place at the right time to the wrong king. Well, maybe the right king, because he was super annoyed, because he wanted to be king of Israel. Wrong, you didn't check any boxes. And we see this, and I want you to understand, Solomon was the wisest, and I'm not saying this to be funny, he was the wisest guy on the planet at that time, and probably of all time. Just think about that for a minute. He's so wise that Solomon chose wise people to be around him. It says in verse 31, he was wiser than all men. Then Ethan of the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. Now, this sounds really obscure, doesn't it to you? These 4 guys, he had more wisdom to them. They didn't even come close. And you say, who are they? Why does it matter? Well, we're going to see that Ethan, the Ezrahite, did I put it right? Yeah. Wrote Psalm 89. And Psalm 89, we'll go to it for a minute. We're going to read both these Psalms. Part of it. Psalm 89 is all about the Davidic covenant, which is fascinating. Because what is Solomon? He's a Davidic king. And he says, I'm wiser than the guy that wrote about the kings. Then the guy Heman, he wrote Psalm 88. And according to 1 Chronicles 15:19, Heman and Ethan were the musicians who played songs for the temple grounds with the cymbals. I don't know about you, that's kind of annoying. Stephanie's not here this morning, but Stephanie in the marching band played cymbals. And I said, you're allowed to do anything you want except practice those things in this house. But that'll get your attention. So let's go to Psalm 88. We'll do Psalm 88 first. Psalm 89 is a little bit more intense. Psalm 88. We're not going to read it all. I just want to give you a feel for this. These are wise men at that time that Solomon was even wiser than. Okay? So it says, many of you may have this above, should have this above, the little small letters. It says a song, Psalm of the sons of Korah for the choir director, according to Malath, Leonoth, a maskil of Heman the Ezrahite. You got that? Everybody got that above the Psalm? That's actually verse 1. That is actually in the Hebrew writing. It's not somebody saying this is a commentary on what this is. This actually says it. It's the signature that comes before the Psalm. And remember, Psalms were meant to be sung and what? Thereby memorized, right? Starts out, O Lord, the God of my salvation, I have cried out day and night, out in the day, by day and in the night before thee. Let my prayer come before thee. Incline thine ear to my cry. My soul has had enough troubles, and my life has drawn near to Sheol. In other words, I'm dying. I'm close to the grave. But I know you've heard me. I reckon among those who go down to the pit, I have become like a man without strength, forsaken among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom thou hadst remember no more, and they are cut out from thy hand. Thou hast put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest places, in the depths. He sounds like he's having a miserable time, isn't it? Know what he's saying, though? God, you've put me here. I don't really know the reason. But I know you have a hand in this. And it says, thy wrath, verse 7, has rested upon me. Thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. And then the next word is Shelah. Know what Shelah means? Take a breath. It's like our musical rest. But this is like, take a breath. Relax. And it's like, I believe most psychons would say this is take a pause. It's called a rest in music. This is probably part of where that had crescended, that had hit its heights, and now we're coming down and we're starting again. Thou hast removed any acquaintances far from me. Thou hast made me an object of loathing to them. I am shut up and cannot go out. My eyes have wasted away because of affliction. I have called upon thee every day, O Lord. I have spread out my hands to thee. Wilt thou perform wonders for the dead? In other words, he's calling upon God saying, don't let me die because you can't do anything that shows anybody your glory through me because I'm dead. Dead people don't do that. They don't bring God the glory that God would if somebody in somebody's life. Well, and that's what we need to do. In situations, we need to call upon the Lord and say, Lord, work through me. I know I'm miserable. I know things are happening to me, but your glory can shine to other people through me. Will the departed spirits rise and praise thee? And take another breath. Chill a little bit. And if you just read this, it's like, okay, we need to step up. Now, notice what he goes to the next verse. Will thy loving kindness be declared in the grave? In other words, if I die, I can't declare anything. I can't speak to people about you. Kind of grabs us and says, we need to do this. Next part of the verse is, thy faithfulness in Abaddon. Abaddon is basically a place of destruction. Will thy wonders be made known in the darkness, and thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? So you can see this is a plea to God in life circumstances. And it's a pretty wise plea. What's the best wisdom that it exudes? Well, number one, tell God the way things are. Not that you're informing him, but you need to say, hey, life's really a bum. I don't like what's going on. I'm about to die, and I don't know about you all. We're all going to die at some point, but how we go is important to some of us, right? But this person sees pretty miserable what's going on in life, but they know overall that God knows what's going on. They know God is involved in what's going on, and they also know that they can't glorify God if they die right now. So they say, Lord, use me. Lord, use me. Because too many people go through things and say, woe is me. I'm useless. God, no, God, use me. I know this is horrible. I know this is horrific. I know what I'm going through. Probably nobody else can understand maybe. But use me in spite of this. Help me be a light. And let people know that in the midst of this crisis, there's God. Verse 8, chapter 89, let's just go over that. This is by Maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite. They're both Ezrahites. Somebody once said maybe they're brothers. Okay. Just because they're both Ezrahites doesn't mean they're brothers. They means they came from Ezra's line. Whoever Ezra is at that time. Probably not the Ezra the prophet you may be thinking about. It's not it. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. Well, that's a great way to start How many just sing of loving kindness of the Lord? The Lord's loving kindness is the word chesed in Hebrew. It's a beautiful word. Wide range of understandings, but that really brings down to you the understanding of what the Lord is like. He's loving. He cares for us no matter what. Not only will I sing for the loving kindness of the Lord, to all generations I will make known thy faithfulness from my mouth. So two beautiful attributes of God are propounded in the first verse. Faithfulness of God and his loving kindness. Verse 2 says, for I have said loving kindness will be built up forever in the heavens. Thou will establish thy faithfulness. I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David my servant. So he's going to recall the words of the Davidic covenant who God has sworn. I want you to understand something. God has taken his very words and said, I have promised this to David, and God cannot go against his very promises. And notice what it says, the other part of it in verse 4 is very important. I will establish your seed forever. Who's David's seed that closely we're talking about? That's Solomon. Now, we know the ultimate seed is Jesus Christ, because he says, I will establish your seed forever. Solomon's not a forever person, as Jesus is and will always be. And I build up your throne to all generations. Take a breath. I like how the psalm said, breathe. I don't know if it's saying that this first stanza is supposed to be said and sung all together in one breath, but that's kind of hard to do, but it does say breathe. Then it says, in the heavens will praise thy wonders, O Lord, thy faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. Notice he keeps repeating the attributes. For who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? A God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones and awesome above all those who are around him. The point of all this is to show you that these two guys had a real grasp on wisdom. They understood it. And Solomon was above them. And from going back to 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 31, we know that no one even really came close. No one had come close. So we see fact number 3, Solomon's wisdom, nobody really came close. Now, just backing up for the last two guys, let me kind of tell you briefly about these two, which kind of go together. Calcol and Darda were from Judah through Tamar through Zerah. They were related to Solomon. But they came from, ready for this? Judah had 2 sons. You guys remember from Wednesday night? Judah had 2 sons, Pharez and Zerah. Pharez was where Solomon came from. David and Solomon came from Pharez. Zerah brought a different line of kids, and that's where these 2 guys came from. They were also probably, Mahal was their mother, so they were related probably to those who sang in the temple. At this point, there's no temple, so they're getting preparations for that. Fact number 4, well, let me just back up before I had one more point that had to do with this one. All these plus Solomon are from the line of Judah, and here's the interesting thing. They were all wise. How would you like that? Growing up in a family that's oriented to wisdom, taking God at his word and applying that to life, being skillful in living God's life for the Lord. They also had to be involved in worship. One was involved in writing, which made worship readily available. Solomon wrote. You guys know that, right? He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, Proverbs. Anybody know the other one? Thank you. Okay. I just want to make sure somebody's listening. Song of Solomon. So he was involved in writing worship, and the other ones were musical. But Solomon was a standout among all of those. Fourthly, Solomon had fame. It says basically that his fame was known around all the surrounding areas, verse 31. His fame, which I find weird. I don't know why they translated this word fame. This word is Shem. Shem means his name, basically his reputation. It could be fame, but it's about Solomon's reputation. It wasn't that he was famous. Solomon had a solid reputation. in all the surrounding nations. When we talk about the surrounding nation, Solomon, and it's interesting because part of the Abrahamic covenant was God would make Abraham's name great. Here's Solomon, who has a reputation around all the nations. His name is great. The Abrahamic covenant was a trickle-down thing. But Solomon's name was great. All the nations, all those surrounding them, he had a reputation. We'll see this later as the Queen of Sheba comes from miles to just check out what was going on in Solomon's household. I'm sure she could have read it in the papers, but she decided to make a personal trip there. And then fact number 5 is Solomon had wisdom, was shown in his writings. Verse 32 says, he spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. Now, I think it's interesting. 3,000 is a lot of proverbs. I don't know how many verses the book of Proverbs has, but I'm pretty sure they don't. No, that's not true. Proverbs has, according to my notes, because I did write it down, Proverbs has 915 verses, Ecclesiastes 222 verses, 117 verses. And now, I'm not stupid. Solomon didn't write it in verses, but this is what we have today. But if you add up all these verses, it's 1,254, and that's not even half of what Solomon wrote. So when you just look at the book of Proverbs for content, it's probably not half the Proverbs Solomon had written somewhere. I don't know if anybody's ever looking for the lost Proverbs of Solomon. I don't think that's happening. 1,005 songs shows somebody counted. Because I would have just been the great bookkeeper that I am. I would have said 1,000. It works. 1,005, well, those 5 mattered, I'm assuming. And it's fascinating to look at that because very few of those are recorded. We have a few Psalms of Solomon, but not many. And we just know that this was, we have, now we're going to spend a few times integrating some of the Proverbs in as we study more on wisdom. But if you just go through this Proverbs, go read chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 7. It's fascinating. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And you see all these ideas of wisdom. Solomon knew his stuff. And according to this, listen, fact number 6, Solomon knew stuff. Now, I don't know how else to put this because when we talk about various clubs that I'm not a member of, like the Mensa Club, for a while I couldn't even, Mesa? What's Mesa? You know? So he says this in verse 33, and he spoke of trees. I don't know about you all. That's kind of like, how important is that in trivia? You know? From the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to hyssop that grows on the wall. In other words, he talked of trees that meant something, that were significant to weeds. He spoke of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. I think it's interesting because I say, you want to know a Jeopardy winner? Solomon. Trivia Pursuits? Solomon. Don't get at the table with that guy. That will irritate you. He knew of trees, from the largest to the smallest. He knew birds, animals. Listen, here's what I wrote this down. I don't know. This is kind of the science he was involved in. Botany, dendrology, which is a study of dendra, which is plants. Zoology, biology, ornithology, which is birds, herpetology, etymology, ithacology, which is fish. How many of you know some of these subjects? You know? It's fascinating. So Solomon was well versed. When he went to talk to Hiram about bringing in trees and talk to the stonecutters about bringing in the various limestone that was needed, he knew what he was buying. He knew the products and he knew the quality of them. I think that's fascinating because most of us say, yeah, I would like that for my house. It looks good. What's the quality? I don't care. It looks good. 3 months later, it's saying, well, it's falling apart. Why would you buy that? Because I didn't know anything about the quality of the product. Solomon knew that. Number 7, Solomon had worldwide notoriety. This is where we're going to end for this morning. We will see that for what we know is a known world at that time, people traveled for miles to see him. Go to chapter 10. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. And since the first day of fall, I'm going to get you out of here a little early so you can go experience it. Happy birthday, Leah. Happy birthday. So he's going to buy you a present because he just said that. He embarrassed you, so he's going to get you something special. And we're all holding him accountable now. Chapter 10, verse 1. Now when the Queen of Sheba, somebody's birthday was yesterday too, we can embarrass everybody then. So anyway, verse 1 says, now when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, notice what she heard. She heard Solomon's fame about God. God was involved. The Lord God was involved. The message was Solomon was a godly man. How many nations is that going to travel to in the world today? How many people running a country today you say, that's a godly person, and it's going to get to you? We have lots of news. Have you ever read anything in the news today that says the president or prime minister of such and such a country, I'd like to name a few, is really a godly man? And most of us say, really? No. Verse 2. Oh, no, the rest of verse 1. She went to Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. She came to test him with difficult questions. Now, we just found out what? He was a Mensa guy. Go ahead, ask me any question. I think I can answer them. And I don't think this was, who's buried in Grant's tomb kind of question. This is probably pretty difficult questions that had to do with ruling and reigning a government, that had to do with integrating God and the oracles of God into a nation, how to rule wisely, how to do those things. She came to Jerusalem with very large rhetoric, with camels carrying spices and very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. I think that's fascinating. All that was on her mind. She came, I'm going to talk to you about everything on my mind. And notice what she came with. She came with a great price. I'm willing to give Solomon, this is how God uses people. I'm willing to give something to Solomon. He probably doesn't need it, but I'm going to give all this to Solomon so that he can answer my questions. And God uses people to do that. Verse 3 says, Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from the king, which he did not explain to her. Again, a fun word. He exegeted anything she wanted. He expounded. You want to know about calculus? I can tell you some of it, but I will tell you the whole thing. So that's basically what he did. He told her the whole thing about that. So when the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he built, and this includes the temple at this time, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters, their attire, his cupbearers, his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit left in her. It was breathtaking. That's what this means. She was just enamored and in awe by this man of God who was king of all Israel, who had wisdom beyond anyone, and she just saw it by how his household functioned. That's pretty cool. So next week we're going to pick up with basically this. What happened? Solomon builds the temple. We'll pick up with that next week. Father, we thank you for this time as we've again looked at this wonderful king, this character study we're doing on how he was given wisdom, how he had accrued it prior, how he had a father who led him in the ways of you, how you as God asked him very kindly and very succinctly to follow everything that had already been written. And as king, he would write the laws daily, that he was a godly man, centered in your word, centered in your promises, understood what they meant, and that he had gained grasp skill for life, and how he acquired it quickly, and how he was, again, honored with riches and honored with awe as other nations saw him as this wonderful leader that he was and a godly man. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be dismissed.